People say drowning is painless. They're wrong. Cold water, the kind that floods a street in April when the river breaks its banks and swallows everything whole, seizes your chest like a fist. Your lungs forget how to work. Every thought narrows to a single terrible point: up. Vesper Crane knew this because she'd learned it the hard way at 9 years old. When a rotten dock gave way and the lake claimed her for 37 seconds before her uncle pulled her out by the collar of her windbreaker. She'd spent the last 17 years avoiding bodies of water that moved too fast, which is why she still couldn't explain, standing on the Linden Street overpass in the wreckage of a spring downpour, why she climbed over the railing. The flooding had started before dawn. 3 weeks of snowmelt and a burst drainage main had turned the Linden underpass into a river where the road used to be. The city had put up sawhorses. The sawhorses were somewhere underwater now. So was a silver sedan that had, in the span of 20 seconds, drifted past the barrier, caught a current no one had expected to exist there, and begun filling like a bathtub. There were people watching. Of course there were, phones raised, recording, the little red dots blinking. Vesper had been walking home from her second shift at the long-term care facility on Adelaide, 12 hours on her feet, another 12 coming in 2 days. The number on her phone showing a balance that didn't cover her mother's medication refill and definitely didn't cover the overdue hydro bill. She should have walked faster. She saw the car window. There was a child's hand pressed against it, small palm, fingers splayed, the universal gesture that no language required. Someone help me. The current was shin-deep where Vesper went over the railing. By the time she reached the car, it was at her waist, the cold so violent it felt like being punched from all directions at once. The child was in the back seat. A girl, small enough that the seatbelt had rendered her essentially stationary, buckled in tight, going nowhere, the water inside the car already at her knees. The window wouldn't break on the first try, wouldn't break on the second. On the third, Vesper used her elbow and the angle she'd memorized from a safety video she'd watched once and then promptly filed in the drawer marked useless knowledge, and the glass gave. She got the door open, got the belt unclipped, got the girl out. She did not remember getting back to the overpass. She only remembered the weight of the child in her arms, lighter than expected, soaked through shaking, and then hands taking her from above, and then the cold sidewalk against her knees, and then a paramedic's voice saying her name in a tone that suggested she'd have to answer eventually. The girl's eyes were brown and enormous. She hadn't made a sound the entire time. The hospital kept Vesper overnight for hypothermia and a laceration on her forearm from the window glass. A very tired officer from Peel Regional took her statement, nodded at appropriate intervals, and left. The next morning, a different officer came. This one had the manner of someone reading from a script they'd been handed at the last minute. "Miss Crane, we need to clarify a few details about last night. Is the girl all right?" He looked at his notes. There was no girl, Miss Crane. Vesper set down her paper cup of terrible hospital tea. "I beg your pardon. The vehicle was unoccupied when our divers reached it. There was no child in the car. No child was admitted to any hospital in the region last night. The hypothermia," he suggested gently, "could affect memory and perception. The cold, the stress. She'd done a brave thing entering the water. But sometimes the mind filled in gaps, made sense of trauma." Vesper had broken a car window with her elbow and pulled 30 kilograms of living, shaking child from a flooding vehicle. She did not say this to the officer. She'd worked long enough in healthcare to know what it sounded like when institutions closed ranks around something they didn't want examined. She went back to work the next afternoon. Split shifts at the Mapleton Care residence, $17 above minimum wage. Her mother's medication auto-renewed on a credit card with 11% interest. The man who walked into the Tim Hortons on Dundas, where Vesper was eating a soup that tasted mostly of salt, belonged there even less than she did. That was her first coherent thought. The second was that the two men who came in behind him had the alert stillness of people professionally paid to anticipate. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than her monthly rent, the kind of tailoring that sits differently than ordinary expensive, because it had been made for one specific body and no other. Dark hair, a jaw like something a sculptor had been angry about, and tattoos. She could see them at the open collar of his shirt, dark lines climbing his throat that his money couldn't quite erase. A saint, maybe. Or something that had started as a saint and become something else entirely. He sat down across from her without asking. Vesper Crane. It wasn't a question. "I'm eating lunch," she said. "I know. You eat here 3 times a week. The chicken noodle, never the chili. You sit by the window because you're afraid of being trapped against a wall." He paused. "My name is Dashiell Montague." She knew the name. Everyone in this city knew the name eventually. The Montague Group, commercial real estate, private equity. The kind of holdings that meant his signature was on buildings she passed every day without thinking about it. And the other things. The things people lowered their voices for. "I don't want any trouble," Vesper said. "You already have it." He folded his hands on the table, clean hands, scarred at the knuckles in a way that suggested trouble had once come looking for him too. "The girl you pulled from that car is my daughter. Esme, she's 7 years old. She's been deaf since birth." Vesper stopped breathing. "She can't speak," Dashiell continued. "She communicates in ASL, American Sign Language, though we've been working on LSQ as well. When the paramedics brought her in, she signed one thing." He held Vesper's gaze. "She asked if the woman who smelled like lavender hand cream was safe." The lavender cream. Vesper bought it at the dollar store on Bloor because her hands cracked in winter from constant washing. She'd had it in her jacket pocket. "She hasn't communicated voluntarily with a stranger in 14 months, Dashiell said. Those were the first words she'd directed at anyone outside our household since the accident. What accident? Something shifted behind his eyes. The one that took her mother. The one that took Esme's confidence along with her hearing, because she was in the vehicle when it happened. He was quiet for a moment. "I keep her hidden, Miss Crane. She lives under an assumed name for school registration. Her face is not photographed. Because in my business, children are leverage, and leverage gets people killed. Someone found out where she was. Someone tampered with the car. What happened on Linden Street was not an accident." The room felt smaller than it had 2 seconds ago. "I need someone to care for my daughter," Dashiell said. "Someone she trusts. Someone willing to enter moving water for a child she'd never met." He watched her steadily. "In return, your mother's medical expenses, current and ongoing, a salary that will make Mapleton Care's wages look like a rounding error, and my guarantee that no one will touch either of you. And if I say no..." He stood, buttoning his jacket with the deliberate unhurry of a man who didn't need to rush anything. "Then I walk out and you go back to your soup." He set a card on the table, heavy stock, embossed. "You have until tomorrow morning. Miss Crane, someone tried to drown my daughter. They'll try again. I need someone who will run toward it instead of standing on the bridge filming." He was gone before the door had stopped swinging. The Montague estate north of the city announced itself first as gates, iron, 12 feet, flanked by stone pillars with cameras mounted at angles that left nothing to chance. The drive curved through old-growth maple and emerged in front of a house that wore its wealth like armor. Grey limestone, tall windows, 3 wings extending like a statement of permanent occupation. Inside, marble, silence, the particular cold of rooms that were cleaned but not lived in. Except for one. Esme's room was on the 2nd floor, east-facing, and it was the only space in the entire building that seemed to breathe. Drawings blanketed every available surface. Marker, crayon, watercolor, the lush chaos of a child working through something she couldn't say out loud. A window seat was piled with cushions in every color that didn't match. Stuffed animals of dubious structural integrity occupied every horizontal surface. Esme looked up when Vesper appeared in the doorway. The girl's eyes went wide, then she signed something fast, turning to look at her father, then back at Vesper. "What did she say?" Vesper asked. Dashiell's voice came from behind her, quieter than she expected. "She asked if you're real." Vesper walked to Esme's level and crouched, then signed, slowly, the way she'd learned from 2 semesters of ASL taken years ago to better communicate with a patient who'd come to rely on her. "I'm real. I'm very glad you're okay." Esme's face went through 12 emotions in 4 seconds. Then she reached out and touched Vesper's forearm, right where the laceration had been butterfly-stitched. "Did that hurt?" she signed. A little. Vesper signed back, "Worth it." The sound that came from Esme then was wordless and high. The involuntary sound of a child who'd been holding themselves together with both hands finally deciding to let someone else carry the weight for a minute. She pressed her face against Vesper's shoulder. From the doorway, Vesper heard Dashiell Montague make a sound she didn't think he'd meant to make. Something that broke open a little at the edges. 3 weeks in, Vesper stopped being afraid of the hallways. She learned Esme's rhythms, the way she needed 20 minutes of quiet after school, the way she communicated complex emotions through drawing rather than sign when the feelings were too large for her hands, the way she laughed without sound but with her whole body when something truly delighted her. She started understanding the house, too, the security rotations, the camera coverage, the staff who moved through rooms like a system that had been running long enough to become invisible. And she started understanding Quentin. Quentin Dalby had been with Dashiell for 14 years. That was the first thing Mrs. Harrow, the housekeeper, compact and exacting, had told her on day one, in the tone of someone establishing hierarchy. 14 years meant the car, the schedule, the security infrastructure. It meant he appeared in doorways just before Dashiell needed him. It meant the other staff said his name with an intonation somewhere between respect and the kind of deference that didn't always have a choice. He was always polite to Vesper, warmly, professionally polite, in a way she'd learned from years working in institutions to recognize as performance. She might not have noticed anything if Esme hadn't dropped her drawing book. They'd been in the library when Esme's book slid off the low table and skidded under the credenza against the wall. Vesper went to retrieve it and found, tucked at the credenza's back corner, where it had clearly been sitting long enough to gather dust, a waterproof dry bag of the kind used for kayaking. Not unusual in a house with a lake on the property. Except the bag was unzipped, and inside was a folded piece of paper with a photograph paper clipped to it. The photograph was Esme, getting into the silver sedan on Linden Street. The paper was a transfer confirmation, 6 figures, cryptocurrency, routed through 3 jurisdictions, dated 6 days before the flooding. Vesper's hands were completely steady when she photographed it. She didn't know why. Some part of her had been waiting for something like this, the way you wait for a test result you already know the answer to. She put the bag exactly as she'd found it, dust pattern included, and walked Esme up to her room for the evening. Then she went looking for Dashiell. His office occupied the corner of the 3rd floor, a room that smelled like old books and the particular discipline required to run an empire without letting anyone see you sweat. He was at his desk when she knocked, shirt sleeves pushed back, the full cartography of his tattoos visible on his forearms, saints and geometry and Latin text she still hadn't decoded, the history of a man written in ink because it refused to be kept internal. He looked up. Is Esme? She's fine, she's asleep. Vesper crossed the room and put her phone on his desk. He looked at the photos. He looked at them for a long time. The silence after was the kind that precedes decisions. Quentin's been with me since I was 28, he said finally, his voice carrying the flatness of someone choosing each word against their own instincts. He was at my wedding. He carried Esme home from the hospital. He took 2 fractures to the hand protecting my family in 2019. I know. Vesper held his gaze. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to look at the photograph. 1 photograph and a transfer from an account I don't recognize. An account sending 6 figures to a destination you don't recognize, dated 6 days before someone sent your daughter into a flooded underpass. Dashiell stood, and the room rearranged itself around him the way rooms did. He came around the desk, and Vesper held her ground, though every rational instinct suggested retreating was reasonable. Up close, she could see the tension in his jaw, the way control cost him something. You've been in my house for 3 weeks, he said. Quentin has been in my life for 14 years. I know. That's not a small thing. I know that too. Vesper didn't raise her voice. There was something clarifying about this, about knowing what she knew, about having been underwater once already for this child, and therefore having nothing additional to fear in this office. I'm not asking you to burn it down on my word alone. I'm asking you to look, have someone else look, an analyst who isn't Quentin's contact, before something happens that you can't fix. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't name. He looked at her long enough that she became aware of the clock ticking somewhere behind her, of the way his sleeve had shifted and revealed 3 inches more of tattooed skin, of the fact that she had not looked away. I'll have it verified, he said. Good. And if you're wrong, then I'm wrong. She picked up her phone. I've been wrong about patience before. I'd rather be wrong and embarrassed than right and watching you plan a funeral. She left, made it to the hallway, pressed both palms flat against the stone wall and breathed until her heartbeat decided to return to normal. Dashiell left on a Thursday, an asset negotiation in Ottawa, 2 days, maybe 3. Quentin was driving him. Or so Vesper was told. She kept Esme close that day without explaining why, played 3 rounds of a board game involving colored tiles that Esme won comprehensively, then helped to start a new drawing. A scene with a woman and a girl by a river. Vesper looked at it for a long time before she understood what it was. That's you, Esme signed, pointing at the figure in the water, and me. It's beautiful, Vesper signed back. Her throat was tight. The lights went out at 2:30 in the afternoon. Not a flicker, not a gradual dimming, every light in the house all at once like a held breath suddenly released. The security panel in the hallway went dark, the faint hum of electronics. always present, constant as weather, stopped. Vesper was already moving toward Esme's room when the door opened. Quentin stood in the hallway. He'd changed out of the driving clothes he'd left in that morning. He was wearing dark utility layers now, the kind of thing you wore when you intended to move quickly and not be remembered. He held a phone in one hand, not a weapon, not yet, but the deliberate way he was standing communicated everything the phone wasn't. Mrs. Crane. His voice was professional, almost kind. Step away from the room. Where's Dashiell? 4 hours away. Step away from the room. Esme appeared in the doorway behind Vesper, and Vesper moved immediately, not away from the room, but into the frame of it, putting herself between Quentin and the girl. Go to your window seat, she signed behind her back, hoping Esme could see her fingers. Bolt the inside latch. Do not come out. This didn't have to involve you, Quentin said, and she heard something real in it, an almost apology, which she supposed was the closest some people got. You were supposed to be a caretaker, not someone who goes looking through other people's things. 14 years, Vesper said. Why? He looked mildly surprised that she'd asked. $2.3 million. He said it the way a person might state the cost of a renovation, matter-of-factly, slightly proud of the number, and a place at the table when the landscape of this city changes in 5 years. Esme's the heir. She can't inherit what she doesn't survive to receive. He moved forward. It's simple math, Miss Crane. Vesper grabbed the brass lamp from the hall table and threw it at his head. It didn't connect cleanly. He moved, but it was enough. She turned and ran for Esme's door, got inside, got the lock turned. Esme was pressed against the wall by the window, her face pale but her eyes fixed on Vesper with absolute concentration. Phone, Vesper signed, frantic. Do you have a phone? Esme shook her head, but she pointed at the bedside table. The tablet. Offline, but the emergency SOS function didn't need internet. It used a cellular backup channel. Vespers grabbed it, opened settings, initiated the emergency protocol she'd configured when setting up Esme's reading apps in week 1. The door took 2 kicks to give way. The facility he drove them to was a decommissioned water treatment plant 40 minutes northeast of the city. A concrete complex the province had been meaning to demolish for 3 years. Backed against a quarry pond that held cold water in all seasons, Vesper was zip-tied in the back seat, was beside her, pressed against her side, not crying, not making a sound, holding Vesper's bound hands with both of hers. Are you scared? Esme signed against Vesper's wrist, the only place she could reach. Yes, Vesper signed back with her fingers. A little. A pause. You'll think of something. Vesper didn't know why that settled her, but it did. The building was cavernous and smelled like mineral water and abandonment. Old processing tanks lined one wall. Catwalks overhead. Emergency lighting, battery-powered, threw everything into green-tinged shadow. Quentin had planned this carefully. Containers of industrial solvent staged near the far wall, labeled with markings that pointed toward a company Vesper recognized from Dashiell's name in the press. A clean frame. Montague's rivals. An industrial accident. His daughter's death appearing to implicate his own supply chain. The fire inspector will attribute it to solvent vapor accumulation, Quentin said, checking his watch. Common in abandoned processing facilities. Vesper's eyes moved across the room. Old instinct, the same one that had catalogued the emergency exits at every care facility she'd ever worked in. Because she had patients who couldn't move themselves, and that meant the exits were her responsibility. She saw it, high on the north wall above the first processing tank, a faded red box. Fire suppression system. Industrial grade, probably 40 years old, possibly functional, because these systems ran on their own pressurized lines and didn't require the building's power grid. She looked at the catwalk between here and there. She had zip-tied hands and Quentin between her and the ladder, and she was fairly certain her ribs had taken a hit at some point in the last hour. Esme pressed her fingers against Vesper's wrist. What are you looking at? Vesper signed one word against Esme's palm, ready. The word Esme signed back wasn't a yes. It was the sign Vesper had taught her in week 2, during a game where Esme had to communicate without Vesper looking. It meant, I'll go left, you go right. 7 years old. Vesper had a sudden, fierce, entirely irrational conviction that this child was going to be absolutely extraordinary. She ran. Quentin was fast, but he'd been expecting something else, a lunge toward the door or a grab for his phone. Not a full sprint toward the far wall with no visible goal. He caught Esme instead automatically, one arm sweeping out, which was what Vesper had been counting on, because it put his attention on a 50-pound child while she hit the ladder rungs on the side of the first processing tank with her bound hands and climbed. She pulled the suppression handle with both fists, using the momentum of her whole body weight. For 2 seconds, nothing. Then the system erupted, ancient, pressurized, undiscerning about where it aimed. Water cascaded from overhead pipes in a cold, sustained torrent. The solvent containers toppled. The lighter Quentin had been reaching for spun across wet concrete and stopped against the far wall, well out of range. And from outside, audible through the concrete, then very suddenly audible through the door, came the sound of vehicles. Dashiell Montague had driven 4 hours in under 2. He came through the main door first, and Vesper, standing on a processing tank catwalk, soaked to the skin with her hands still zip-tied together, decided this was not the moment to evaluate what it meant that she was genuinely, completely relieved to see him. He had a team of 6 behind him, which seemed like the right number. One of them had Quentin in a hold before he'd fully registered that the room had changed. Dashiell crossed the floor in 12 seconds and had Esme off the ground in 13. She signed something fast into his shoulder, too quick for Vesper to catch from her angle. He held the back of his daughter's head with one hand and pressed his eyes closed. Then he looked up. Vesper climbed down from the tank, which was less graceful than she'd hoped and involved a certain amount of wrist scraping. One of the security team produced a multi-tool and cut the zip tie without being asked. Dashiell set Esme down very carefully and walked to Vesper. "You were right," he said. His voice was low, controlled but only technically. Underneath it was something with no name she had a ready word for, not gratitude, which was too small, and not relief, which was too simple. "I know," Vesper said, because she was tired and soaked, and her ribs ached, and she had earned this moment. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. Then he pulled her into him, one hand at the back of her head, and just held on. She felt his shoulders shaking. Once only, before he brought everything back under control. But once was enough. "Papa," Esme said aloud, the word clear, startlingly real in the concrete space, the first spoken word Vesper had heard from her. They both looked at her. Esme was pointing at the two of them together. She signed something, smiling the particular smile of a child who has identified an adult situation and found it entirely satisfying. "What did she say?" Vesper asked. Dashiell didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had done something new. It had let go of something it had been holding for a very long time. She said finally. 5 months later, the estate looked different from the outside. The same gates, the same limestone facade, but the east wing windows were lit up in colors because Esme had been given veto power over the sitting room curtains and had chosen yellow. Vesper found Dashiell in the garden on a Sunday in September. Sleeves rolled to the elbow, the tattoos fully visible in the afternoon sun, crouched over a bed of new plantings with the expression of a man who had recently discovered that perennials required more maintenance than they advertised. "Esme wants a pollinator garden," he said without looking up. "Apparently I cannot simply purchase butterflies. They have opinions about the flowers." Vesper sat on the low stone wall beside him. "How's the lavender coming?" Aggressively, he brushed dirt from his hands and sat back, looking at her. "The horticulturist I hired seems to believe I'm approaching competence. I think she's being generous." "You hired a horticulturist." "My daughter wants butterflies." He said it simply, the way he said most things that clearly mattered enormously to him. "I learn what I need to learn." It was like that with him. The same focused attention he'd applied to building an empire now directed at understanding how Esme's speech therapy worked, at memorizing the signs for her 40 most used phrases, at learning that butterflies needed specific flowers and that his daughter needed specific things too, and that both were worth the effort of figuring out. He stood, and for a moment they were close enough that she could read the Italian phrase written across his inner forearm. Words she'd asked about weeks ago and he'd translated as, "What is built in fire does not burn again." "I don't know how to do this," he said. The directness of it, without preamble, was so characteristically him that she almost smiled. "I've built things, I've managed significant complexity. But this specific," he gestured between them, slightly awkward in a way she'd never seen from him before, "I don't have a framework for." "Neither do I," Vesper said. "I thought if I was honest about it." "It helps," she looked at him. "It helps a lot, actually." He reached into his jacket pocket and brought out a box, small, dark green, the kind that required no introduction. When he opened it, the ring inside caught the September light. A pale sapphire the color of clear water, set low and clean, the kind of thing that would survive a career of constant hand-washing and could be worn under a glove. "I'm not asking you to sign up for what I was," Dashiell said. He dropped to one knee on the garden path, dirt on his $1,000 trousers, and looked up at her with an expression she'd never seen from him before, open, undefended, just a person asking a question they didn't know the answer to. I'm asking you to stay for what I'm trying to become. A father who learns about pollinators. A man who's trying to build something that doesn't need walls around it to survive. Vesper's eyes burned. Marry me, Vesper. Not because you ran into the water and that started everything, though I'll owe you for that for the rest of my life. But because my daughter trusts you, and I trust you, and I've spent 5 months discovering that those are the 2 most difficult things I'm capable of. Footsteps on the garden path. Esma peered around the corner of the hedgerow at speed, her tablet under her arm, clearly having been dispatched on some errand and then gotten distracted by a bug. She looked at her father on one knee. She looked at Vesper. She looked at the box. Then she signed something at such velocity that Vesper only caught half of it. But she caught yes repeated 4 times in succession, which seemed sufficient. Vesper laughed. The sound came out surprised and wet and entirely real. Ask me again, she said to Dashiell, slowly. He did. She said yes. Esma made the soundless, full-body sound that meant pure joy, and launched herself at both of them with enough force to knock them sideways on the garden path, and they stayed there in the afternoon, light, tangled and laughing, the 3 of them, while the lavender grew aggressively and the butterflies, in due time, would come. People talk about being saved like it's something that happens once. Like a door you walk through and find yourself on the other side of, changed and done. Vesper had been underwater twice in her life. She knew that wasn't how it worked. It happened in kitchens and hallways and garden paths. In the moment someone decided you were worth learning for. In the moment a 7-year-old girl pressed her face against your shoulder and handed over the whole weight of her trust. In the moment you stopped calculating whether the risk was worth it and just jumped. She'd gone into the water for a stranger's child. She'd climbed out with a family. That, she thought, as Esme signed something elaborate and ridiculous, and Dashiell tried to interpret it with furrowed concentration and failing composure, was a story worth every cold, terrifying second it had cost her to find.